The film introduction contains several photographs of President Kennedy and President Johnson, addressing crowds, meeting with key leaders, and at work in their offices.
Hello, and welcome to
A uniformed
the
park
JFK
ranger
and
appears in front of a
LBJ,
visual background
the
of student
New
protesters.
Frontier in the Great Society special webisode series. During these webisodes, we will be comparing JFK and LBJ and examining them from a human perspective. Today, we will focus on their origin stories, focusing on great-grandparents, grandparents, and parents, and a look at legacy. Today, we have Park Ranger Jonathan Streff from the John Fitzgerald Kennedy National Historic Site, and Park Ranger Joseph Owen from the Lyndon Johnson National Historical Park. I am Joy Kinard, and I'm the superintendent of the Central Alabama Civil Rights Sites. Legacy is a major part of the stories we look at, looking at the legacy of Booker T. Washington and his family's home we protect here in Alabama, the Oaks, the legacy of innovation in agriculture, looking at Dr. George Washington Carver and his historic laboratory on the campus of Tuskegee University. We protect the legacy of the famed Tuskegee Airmen and their training academy we protect, along with the Selma to Montgomery March, looking at the height of tensions during the Civil Rights Movement and the legacy of foot soldiers who walked 54 miles to protest their right to vote, like Congressman John Lewis, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Amelia Boynton Robinson, and the Courageous Eight, and others who left a legacy of citizenship, participatory engagement, and the changes to the American political system. This 54-mile trail we protect and administer has a rich legacy. Hey, Jonathan.
Hey, Joy, how are you?
I'm good. Hey, Joseph.
Hi, how are you? It's good to be here.
Good, good. So let's get right into our discussion about legacy and origins, because our audience is dying to know. Let me ask my first question, which is, how did the experiences of the great-grandparents shape the circumstances of each family?
Well, Joy, I think I'll go
A
ahead
uniformed
and start
park
with that one
ranger
again.
in front of
Thank
a
you for being
visual
here,
background of
today.
JFK's
So, I
birthplace,
think when
a
most
gray,
folks think of
three-story
John
house
Fitzgerald
with dark
Kennedy,
green
they think of him
shutters.
as president, but as we're all well aware, and you can see behind me here, he was born in a home in 1917 in Brookline, not too far away from where I'm sitting. But that story really starts in Ireland in the mid-19th
Photograph
century.
of the
with
Boston
mass
Irish
exodus
Famine
of Irish
Memorial
Catholic immigrants
in
who
modern
were
Boston.
arriving here in the
One
United
side
States
showing
due to the
statues
Great Famine,
of a
the Great
family
Hunger.
devastated by the famine, the other showing their
John F.
opportunity
Kennedy's
in America.
great-grandparents, sets of great-grandparents, are going to arrive in the Boston area during this time period. And their circumstances will be similar, but also different to the average famine immigrant during this time period. They will be arriving in Boston, which is basically a very hostile environment. We're in essence an island community. The community is very homogeneous, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. So the so-called Brahmins were not very happy when significant numbers of Irish Catholics began to pour in. So on the Kennedy side of the family, you have Patrick Kennedy. He's going to be coming from County Wexford in Ireland. And what's a bit different about him is that unlike many of these other immigrants, he had a marketable skill. He was a cooper. He could work with wood. He could make barrels, unlike many of the folks who are agricultural workers. So he's going to be arriving from Wexford in 1849. And the woman he eventually marries is a woman named Bridget Murphy. And we don't know a lot about her. We do know that eventually her relatives are going to arrive here, but those two are going to fall in love, and they're eventually going to give birth to three children. What's really interesting to note is that approximately 60% of the kids who'd be born into difficult circumstances here in Boston and basically into the slums, 60% of those children would die. Most of those folks are not going to make it out of pre-adolescence. So they have a third child.
Hand-colored version of a young Joe Kennedy Sr.
And
in
when
an
he's about
ornate
3 years
frame,
of age, his father takes
1895.
him. So what's going to happen is that Bridget Murphy is going to have to kick into high gear. She goes to work as a domestic servant. She also cuts hair. She also will eventually become a small business owner as well. And so she will propel her family forward despite the fact that her husband is dead. And so she is like many Irish immigrant women and arguably many immigrant women today in the United States who oftentimes have to take on extra tasks, extra burdens to take care of their family and the community surrounding them. So I'll say one more thing about the Kennedy side of the family. So PJ, JFK's grandfather, is going to start work as a young man on the docks of East Boston, loading and unloading ships all day. Then he becomes a pub owner by the time he's in his mid-20s. And for the Irish, especially in Boston, pubs were much more than a place to go and get a pint. They were a place to organize politically, to get information, and to also seek out community as well. So he becomes a trusted member of the community, and eventually he's going to become involved in local level politics. So we have politics on that side of the family. Other side of the family, great-grandparents, we have Thomas Fitzgerald, who's coming in 1850. And he, unlike many Irish immigrants, really wanted to own a farm. He wanted to move out west and have himself a farm. And so he arrives here, and his brother comes as well. He's going to settle the North End. And for folks who are familiar with Boston, the North End today is an area where a lot of Italian immigrants have settled. But in the 1840s, it was all Irish. So Thomas works outside of Boston for a while, but eventually becomes a fish cart peddler. And so he'll be selling fish in the city of Boston. He ends up falling in love with a woman named Rosanna Cox, and they're going to get married. Now, what's interesting is he's all set to leave Boston, and then his brother approaches him and says, I would like to open a grocery store. And Thomas decides to stay, in large part because his brother is asking him. This is where his church is. This is where his family is. This is where his community is. So you have PJ over in East Boston with his pub, creating kind of a political environment. Thomas is going to have a grocery store that at night doubles as a pub. So it'll be serving sort of the same interests for folks in the North End as for folks in East Boston. So again, on both sides of the family, great-grandparents and grandparents, you have this political angle that's there, but also a strong sense of community, a strong sense of public service that we'll talk more about when we get into more detail about the parents.
That is fascinating. Joseph?
Lyndon Johnson's great-grandparents, his great-great-grandparents, really were distinguished.
A uniformed park ranger sits in front of a blue-gray background with a wooden door and hanging picture frames.
Jesse Johnson, who was born in Oglethorpe County, Georgia in 1795. He married Lucy Webb Barnett. Not much is known about her in Georgia, and together they raised 3 children. One thing which is interesting about Jesse was he served as a sheriff in Georgia, and then they moved briefly to Alabama in 1838, where they engaged in the cattle business. So the cattle industry is way back in Lyndon Johnson's forefathers. Jesse was a man of great charity, and he was very kind to his neighbors and took home his brother's 5 children to raise by himself. And Jesse was described as energetic, civic-minded, and had an interest in politics and government. So you could see where Lyndon Johnson gets all of that from way back. He was devoted to his community and was a member of the Baptist Church. Now, his great-grandmother, Lucy, not much is known about her. She was born in Georgia and was thought to have 5 brothers and some sisters. Now, Jesse died in 1856 and Lucy died in 1857, and they're both buried in Texas, in Lockhart, Texas. Now, Lyndon Johnson's great-grandfather was George Washington Baines, his maternal great-grandfather. And George was a prominent Texan. He was a very important Texan back in the day. He was a friend of Texas founder Sam Houston. He was self-educated, and he was able to get a quality education that he taught himself because he went to the University of Alabama, where he graduated in 1836. And in 1834, he became a preacher at a Baptist church in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. And in 1840, he married Melissa Ann Butler, who was born in North Carolina. And later they had to move to Arkansas. Now, George had a lot of health problems throughout his life. And so they moved to Arkansas for a little while. And then in 1850, they moved to Texas, where he preached. And that's where he became a personal friend of Sam Houston Johnson during the Texas Revolution. And George became president of Baylor University up in Waco and was the editor of the Texas Baptist newspaper. And because he experienced poor health, he had to resign from being president of Baylor University in 1863 during the Civil War. Now, George unfortunately died of malaria a day before his 74th birthday. But he had a very, very interesting life. He was a tough gentleman, self-taught. He was able to become president of Baylor University. He was able to become an editor of a Baptist newspaper. And this is all because of his ambition and his focus. And his grandparents, Lyndon Johnson's grandparents was, paternal grandparents was Sam Ely Johnson.
Black and white photo
Sr.
of Sam Ely Johnson Sr.
And in 1856, he and brother Tom moved to Texas. And right before the Civil War, they were purchasing cattle at the Johnson Cattle Settlement, which is one of the largest cattle settlements in central Texas. And it was a thriving business, but when Texas seceded from the Union in 1861, Sam Sr. and his brother Tom joined the Confederate Cavalry. But after the Civil War, he went back into the cattle business. He was raising Texas Longhorns on the Chisholm Trail. And it was a tough life. Out there next to our visitor center, we have the Johnson Cattle Settlement. And it was it was very hot, Texas being always hot. It was also a very, how can I say this? It was a place where the Comanches, the Native Americans, used to do a lot of raids in central Texas. And one raid is where Sam had to go with a posse. Sam Sr. went with a posse to chase one band of Comanches while another band was at the cattle settlement. And
black and white photo
wife,
of Eliza
Ruth,
Johnson
had to hide underneath the cabin with her daughter and had to remain perfectly silent. And once they heard you, you were in big trouble. And so that was the kind of life that Sam Sr. had. Now, from 1867 to 1872, it was a good year good years for the cattle settlement. On one cattle drive up on the Chisholm Trail, Sam made over $100,000 in gold coin, which was several $1 million today. However, Tom, the brother of Sam, was also an equal partner, and Tom made some bad investments. So the creditors came looking for their money. Sam Sr. had to sell the cattle settlement and move out to what is today the LBJ Ranch, where Lyndon Johnson was born. And
black and
Sam
white photo
died
of a
in
Johnson family in front of a
1915.
single-story
Lyndon
farmhouse
Johnson was
home,
just a young man.
circa
But it was
1893 through
Sam's
1897.
experiences being a cowboy.
Eliza Johnson
It was
and Sam
his
Eli Johnson
great-grandfather's,
Sr.
George
stand in the
Washington
middle of the
Baines,
photograph.
self-taught, really influenced Lyndon Johnson. And you could see that evident in Lyndon Johnson's life. Sam Jr., the president's father, which we'll talk about a little later, was also an educator. His mother, Rebecca Baines Johnson, was an educator. And they got that from their parents and from their grandparents. So it was a theme that was throughout the Johnson and Baines family tree, was education, hard work, and living in Texas in very, very hostile situations at times.
Wow, that is incredible. Thank you for that. Okay, the next question is, how do the frontier experiences of the Johnson family and the immigrant experiences of the Kennedy and Fitzgerald families connect with larger themes of the American experience?
I'll go ahead and speak to that. I mean, I think Joe did a great job just now sort of talking about some of those elements. And I'm, thinking about points of comparison in terms of, environment. I had the chance to visit the LBJ site back in December, and having read a lot and experienced some of that. Joe, as you talked about, the environment is very important. Going to this space and getting a sense of the land. And I really came to understand how the land shaped those three generations that you talked about. I also came going to the ranch. We'll talk about that later on. Why LBJ wanted to go back there. Even though the country is rough, even though it's unforgiving, even though it's difficult to make a living there, at the same time, it's extraordinarily peaceful. Now, obviously, the environment you just talked about with indigenous people pushing back against these settlers who are attempting to make a living there is going to make things uncomfortable, but they're trying to eke things out. And I think the same kind of thing is going on in Boston with the great grandparents and the grandparents. They're in an environment that is extraordinarily hostile. And I think that compares a lot with what folks dealt with prior to that and folks are continuing to deal with today. The Irish, as they're arriving in Boston, also in the United States, around the same time period that Joe's talking about, are being pushed back. The Germans that are settling in Texas are also being questioned. And I think one of the things that I find particularly interesting, and I think Joe will probably talk about this more, is LBJ's dad very much sticks up for German immigrants, very much is going to bat for these people and recognizing what they're contributing, but also recognizing that these folks are attempting to do exactly what folks are trying to do in Texas, which is to make a life for themselves. And they're willing to work hard and they're willing to sacrifice, but they need to be given the chance to do so. And I think that's a pretty significant theme in American history in terms of subsequent generations of folks who are coming in. Now, I think from the Irish standpoint and the Kennedy standpoint, what's interesting is that the Kennedys, I think fairly early on, JFK's
black and white photo of John Francis Fitzgerald seated wearing a suit in 1906
about this topic in the late 19th century when the conversations about restricting immigration are going on. He's going to be going toe-to-toe with this guy named Henry Cabot Lodge, who is calling for literacy tests, who's calling for restrictions on immigrants coming in. And John Francis Fitzgerald, who's a member of the House of Representatives at that point, is living in an area where there are not only Irish immigrants, but a significant number of Italians and also Eastern European Jews who are fleeing religious persecution. And he approaches Henry Cabot Lodge and said, basically, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, my people came on boats, your people came on boats. All of these folks are coming to America trying to make a new life for themselves. We should let them in and allow them to participate in all of that. So I think from the immigrant standpoint, you definitely have that, but I think it connects with the frontier themes that Joe was just talking about so well.
Wow. Thank you. Joseph, did you have anything else you wanted to add to this question?
Yes,
I know you did talk about it, but I just feel like you have something else to share.
Oh, sure. Yes, I sure do. I made a error. LBJ's great-grandmother's name was not Ruth, it was Eliza.
Thank you.
One thing which Jonathan really brushed on very good was the immigrant experience. And an interesting thing about the German experience in the Hill Country, the town of Fredericksburg was pretty much the major German town in central Texas. And they were in Gillespie County. And right next to is Blanco County. They were one of the very few counties in 1861 to vote against secession, to not join the Confederacy. And the reason why is because the Germans were abolitionists. They believed that everybody should be free. I think what happened is their stories about being serfs throughout the generations really had an effect. The serf was a family that was bound to the land and to the land baron, or to the specific family that owned the land. And they realized what a tough existence it was. And so they remember those stories and they came to America to be, to start having, the experiences of American freedom. They heard the American story. And so in German communities throughout Texas, and Fredericksburg being the major one, it was having everybody be equal. And so they did not vote for secession in 1861. And it's those kind of experiences that were passed down to Lyndon Johnson, to his father, Sam Jr., which you're going to see where Sam Jr. was an early proponent of civil rights. He would stand up against some very, very bad people. People that, back during Reconstruction, you had the Ku Klux Klan. And Sam would actually stand up against that, and he would protect his friends, the people that he worked with. He owned a farm. He saw how tough a Mexican migrant family was, and he would constantly stand up for him against a lot of insurmountable odds. And that was the kind of thing that Lyndon Johnson noticed. And also, like I said, the experience of living in Texas on the frontier, the Old West, that was Texas. That was where Lyndon Johnson's grandfather, Sam Sr., was used to, overcoming the odds of environment, overcoming the hostile Native Americans, and also learning about the stories of German communities and how they were abolitionists and believed in equality for all.
Wonderful, Joseph. Thank you so much for that. You just reminded me of how many connections that my sites have to actually both presidents, looking at Tuskegee, Alabama, and even Selma, Alabama, and looking at how people just wanted a better life, whether they were born here as enslaved people, whether they migrated here through immigration. People just came here for a better life, and that's what I think resonates so much between all of our sites. It's definitely showing through and through. Now, this is the last question we have. How did the environment of Ireland and Boston shape the Kennedy and Fitzgerald family story? And how did the environment of Texas, and more specifically, the Hill Country, shape the Johnson, Baines, Bunton family stories?
Yeah, again, I think we've done a good job of covering a lot of this already. The one thing that I will say is that some historians have argued that John F. Kennedy's connections with Ireland were sort of put forward as kind of a political front. But I would argue that that's not the case, that this is sort of very much a part of who he was. He visited Ireland numerous times when he was an adolescent and also in college. But probably the most important trip was when he went in June of 1963 as president. John F. Kennedy, of course, the first Irish-American Catholic president of the United States. Joe Biden's only the second Catholic that we've elected. So there's definitely conversations to be had there in terms of prejudice. The prejudice that his great-grandparents and arguably his grandparents faced as being Catholic in America, he's going to face in 1960, nearly 100 years later. He's in Texas. He goes to Houston. He goes to the Houston Ministerial Conference and faces a lot of flack. The big concern was that as an Irish Catholic, he would be more beholden to the Pope as opposed to being beholden to the voters of the United States. And he makes a very famous statement that I am not the Catholic candidate for president of the United States. I'm the Democratic Party's candidate for president of the United States. So obviously holding on to his faith, holding on to his ethnic identity, but also suggesting that these both can exist at the same time. But simultaneously, this is the United States of America. So we can have multiple identities, but at the end of the day, there's a unifying force that's here. As I was mentioning before, this is something that both sets of grandparents are fighting for. But when John F. Kennedy goes to
Colored
Ireland
photo of large crowd gathered in the streets around a car which President Kennedy is riding in. Flags of Ireland are visible hanging off buildings.
Receives a hero's welcome there. He is going to talk a lot about the immigrant experience. He's going to talk a lot about his own family's experience. He goes to County Wexford and talks about Patrick, his great-grandfather, and talks about when he left for East Boston, he left with nothing but a strong faith and a strong desire for liberty, just like Joe was talking about, just like you were talking about, Joy. People come to this country or are living in the country if you're an indigenous person, or if you're an enslaved person, you're forced to come here. The moment you step on American shores, you're looking for a way to push forward. You're looking for a way to survive. You're looking for a way to be accepted. And obviously, it's easier for some groups than others. These conversations are still going on today, but I think the connection between all of our sites is that, and I think, Joe, you put this quite well just a moment ago, is all of these things are connected. All of these stories are connected. You can talk about John F. Kennedy, you can talk about LBJ, but they connect to John Lewis, right? It connects back to what Joe was talking about with Reconstruction. It connects with the Tuskegee Airmen who are attempting to serve their nation, even though their nation's not recognizing their humanity. So there's a lot more commonalities here than I think folks oftentimes recognize. And I know, both all of us are educators. The rest of the year, when I'm not a park ranger, I'm a high school history teacher. And I think the moment that students, or the moment that people are able to sort of connect those dots and make those connections, all these stories make much more sense.
Totally agree. Thank you, Jonathan. Joseph?
You have a good question about the environment. The environment definitely shaped the Johnson, Bunting, and Bain stories. The environment of Texas, the hill country, the toughness you had to have. A lot of families try to have farms in Texas, but were not able to because of the arid dryness of central Texas, the environment of not being able to grow crops because it's very rocky. The soil of Texas in this hill country is a lot different than what you would find in like Nebraska or Iowa, where the land was fertile. A lot of families found out the hard way that was not true. However, some families that were able to persevere and overcome those hard obstacles were able to thrive, were able to at least survive. And it's the stories like this of Lyndon Johnson's grandfather, Sam Sr. Now, Sam Sr. Died when LBJ was a little boy. So he really didn't have a chance to know his grandfather that well.
Okay.
But it was the stories that were told by Sam Jr., his son, about how Johnson family was able to have a thriving cattle settlement. It was a big influence on Lyndon Johnson because when Lyndon Johnson left the presidency in 1969, the first thing he wanted to do was establish the Lyndon Johnson Historical Park. Back then it was the Lyndon Johnson National Historic Site. And he wanted to purchase Sam Sr., his grandfather's cattle settlement. That way he could tell the story of the family and how they were able to overcome the environment. And eventually he was able to have his grandfather's cattle settlement be part of the Lyndon Johnson National Historical Park. So those are the proud roots that Lyndon Johnson had. And also with education, with his grandfather, Joseph
A black
Baines.
and white
Now,
photo of
Baines,
Joseph W. Baines
LBJ's
with a white
maternal
beard.
grandfather died a year before Lyndon Johnson was born. But Joseph was a very distinguished gentleman. He was a man who was educated. He was a Secretary of State of Texas at one time. He was also a man, unfortunately, that was able to have some hard times. Now, both the Johnsons and the Baines would experience poverty. And some years were good, some years were bad. And that would happen with Lyndon Johnson's father, Sam Jr., and with his grandfather, Joseph Baines. And these are the stories that Lyndon Johnson heard as well, was that there was not easy times that these families went through, but it really helped shape the Lyndon Johnson story of perseverance, of being a proud Texan. As a matter of fact, LBJ wanted to have a ranch started around 1950 when he was still in the Senate. And he wanted to be known as a gentleman rancher, as a gentleman cattleman. He was very conscious of his image, especially in the Senate, because back in the 1950s, people really didn't know that much about Texas. And they always considered congressmen from Texas as being what they call Texas yokels. LBJ was very conscious of that. And he wanted to show people that he was not a hick or a Texas hick. He wanted to show people that his family were cattlemen, that he was proud of their family. He was proud of being a Texan. And one of the things he tried to do was show how not only was he a president, but he was also a gentleman rancher. And that was really, really, really important to President Johnson.
Wow, this has been fascinating. I want to learn more and more and hear you all more and more, but we are out of time. Please join us with our next episode being about childhood. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Credit slides of white text on a black background roll, identifying and thanking those who appeared in the video and those who helped edit and produce the video series.